Gilles De Rais, a name once synonymous with heroism, nobility, and valor, is now remembered for one of the darkest chapters in history. A man of great fame, wealth, and influence, De Rais was celebrated for his role as a military captain in the 100 Years' War, where he fought alongside Joan of Arc, a heroine who would later be canonized. His bravery and commitment on the battlefield earned him titles, land, and the respect of his peers. But hidden beneath this outwardly noble image was a terrifying monster one whose actions would forever tarnish his name and haunt the people of France. De Rais was a man who seemed to have it all. A knight, a hero, a landowner, his wealth and position should have brought him respect and admiration. But instead, it became the foundation for a tragic descent into madness. After the war, his life took a dark turn, and it was in his grand castle that the horrors would unfold. The walls of his estate, once a symbol of power and prestige, would soon become a prison of unspeakable atrocities. It was here, within the confines of his imposing castle, that Gilles De Rais would reveal his true nature. His acts of violence were not born from mere cruelty. They were fueled by a twisted obsession with power, control, and the supernatural. His descent into depravity began with a deepening interest in the occult and alchemy, as he sought dark forces that promised immortality and infinite power. His delusions led him to believe that his future success required human sacrifices, particularly young women, to secure his dark ambitions. Women from the surrounding villages, many of them poor and desperate, were lured to De Rais' castle with promises of safety, work, or even marriage. But what awaited them inside the castle walls was a nightmare they could not escape. The castle, once a place of refuge, had become a house of terror. De Rais had transformed from a respected military leader into a monstrous predator, his actions driven by an insatiable hunger that no amount of wealth or power could ever satisfy. The women who entered his castle quickly found themselves trapped. They were no longer individuals with their own lives, hopes, or dreams. To De Rais, they were nothing more than objects, mere tools for his twisted rituals. The terrifying truth of his castle was that it had become a killing ground, where the lives of innocent women were snuffed out with terrifying regularity. Many of the women were subjected to sadistic torture, their screams echoing through the stone walls, unheard by anyone but the ghosts of the past. The atrocities committed by De Rais were not isolated incidents. They became part of a horrifying pattern, a ritual that he continued to carry out with chilling precision. He would carefully select his victims, choosing them from the nearby villages and bringing them into his fold. But once inside his castle, they were doomed. Gilles De Rais' insanity and lust for power had led him to a horrific belief that he could somehow gain immortality or the favor of dark forces by sacrificing these women. Witnesses who survived to tell the tale spoke of unimaginable horrors. Women were locked away in cells, tortured, and brutally murdered, often in the most grotesque ways. De Rais was known for using his power and status to manipulate others into assisting in his dark deeds. His servants, either complicit in his actions or too frightened to resist, were forced to carry out the gruesome tasks he ordered. The stories of those who managed to escape or were freed from his clutches paint a picture of terror that no one could have imagined in such a grand, noble estate. As the years passed, the number of victims continued to rise. The castle, which had once been a hub of noble life, became a macabre chamber of horrors. Rumors of missing women began to circulate, but few dared to speak out. The people who lived near the castle were either too afraid or too ignorant to understand what was truly happening behind the grand doors. And those who dared question the man who had once fought for the country's freedom found themselves facing his wrath. But De Rais' power, his wealth, and his influence could not shield him forever. As the dark deeds continued, whispers of his actions reached the ears of the authorities. The silence that had protected him began to crack. The truth of what had happened inside his castle was about to be exposed, but at what cost? And how could anyone have imagined that the same man who had been a hero of France could fall so deeply into depravity? His trial, when it finally came, shocked the world. The extent of his crimes was beyond belief. But even as he was arrested and put on trial, the damage had already been done. The once heroic knight, the man who had been a beacon of hope for his country, was now reduced to a symbol of terror. His legacy had been destroyed not by the battles he fought or the titles he earned, but by the horrifying acts he had committed behind closed doors. Gilles De Rais is a cautionary tale, a reminder that power and fame do not always protect from the darkness within. The castle, once a place of glory, had become the very birthplace of evil. The women who entered its gates never stood a chance, and the man who had once fought to protect his country was now remembered as a monster. As the horrific deeds of Gilles De Rais continued within the walls of his castle, the true extent of his monstrous behavior was shrouded in secrecy. His power and influence had allowed him to cover up his gruesome actions for years, but as more women disappeared without a trace, the whispers of the villagers grew louder. The tale of the once heroic knight turned sadistic murderer would soon come to light in ways no one could have imagined. The investigation into De Rais began after an increasing number of missing women were reported in the surrounding villages. Villagers who had once respected him now started to speak of strange happenings near his castle, of women who were lured there under false pretenses and never seen again. At first, these stories were dismissed, overshadowed by the noble reputation De Rais had cultivated. But as more witnesses came forward, the authorities had no choice but to investigate. The truth that was uncovered was more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. Inside his castle, Gilles De Rais had created a world of terror, one where he could indulge in his darkest desires without fear of reprisal. The bodies of his victims were found in the most disturbing conditions. The rooms where the women were held showed signs of long-term suffering, with walls marked by desperation and anguish. The torture chambers, once hidden in the deepest corners of the castle, revealed the unimaginable cruelty of a man who had no regard for human life. De Rais was not only a sadistic killer, but also a man who believed he could gain power from the suffering of others. His twisted obsession with the occult and alchemy led him to engage in bizarre rituals that involved the mutilation of his victims. It was said that he believed these gruesome acts would grant him eternal life or bring him favor with dark forces. His obsession with the supernatural had taken hold of him, and he viewed these women not as human beings, but as expendable sacrifices in his pursuit of immortality. Many of the victims were young girls, often no older than 12 or 13. They were innocent, naive, and easily manipulated. De Rais would often charm their families with promises of a better life for their daughters, offering them a place in his household. Once inside, however, they were trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. The acts of cruelty inflicted upon them were so grotesque that even the bravest investigators could barely stomach the details. The castle's once beautiful halls had become the site of depravity. What had once been a symbol of wealth and power now stood as a symbol of horror. The very stones of the castle seemed to have absorbed the pain, suffering, and death that had occurred within. The grand banquets De Rais held for his guests, the lavish feasts, were a stark contrast to the horrors taking place behind closed doors. While noblemen and women dined and celebrated, others languished in chains, awaiting their tragic fate. It wasn't just the victims who suffered. De Rais' servants, those who worked within the castle, were complicit in his actions or too terrified to resist. Some were forced to carry out his horrific commands, while others turned a blind eye, too frightened of the repercussions to speak out. The fear and control that De Rais exerted over those around him ensured that no one dared cross him, and his reign of terror continued unchecked for far too long. But as the investigation gained momentum, the authorities were finally able to piece together the truth. The sheer scale of his crimes was shocking, and soon his trial became one of the most notorious in French history. The charges against him were a chilling catalogue of horror: the abduction, torture, and murder of young women, many of them from local villages. It was clear that De Rais had crossed a line from being a respected nobleman to a monster whose crimes defied all comprehension. De Rais tried to defend himself during the trial, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. His once glorious reputation as a military hero was shattered, replaced by the image of a deranged, sadistic killer. In the end, he was found guilty of countless murders, and the court condemned him to death. But even as he faced his judgment, the true extent of his depravity had left a stain on history that could never be erased. The execution of Gilles De Rais was swift, but it was also a grim reminder of the horrors that had taken place within the walls of his castle. As he was led to his death, the people of France were left to ponder how someone who had once fought for the country's freedom could fall so far from grace. The castle, which had once been a place of honor and power, had become the site of one of the most horrifying chapters in French history. De Rais' story serves as a dark lesson, a reminder that even those who are celebrated as heroes can fall prey to the most sinister of forces. His tale is one of corruption, obsession, and madness, a cautionary story of the dangers of unchecked power and the depths of depravity that can exist within the human soul. While his reign of terror ended with his death, the memories of his monstrous acts live on, haunting the people who were touched by his evil. As we reflect on the legacy of Gilles De Rais, we are reminded that darkness can hide behind even the brightest of facades. A man who was once a hero became a villain in the most unimaginable way. The castle where he once held court will forever be remembered not as a place of glory, but as the place where evil took root and thrived.